Welcome to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where tonight we'll journey through magical corridors, enchanted classrooms, and the peaceful grounds of the castle. Join us as we explore the wizarding world in a story designed to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. After our story concludes, you'll hear the gentle crackling of a common room fire to help you fall asleep. There will be no advertisements or interruptions, just the continuous, soothing sounds of flames to carry you into your dreams. Now take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let's begin our magical adventure. The rain drummed steadily against the ancient windows of Hogwarts, creating a soothing rhythm that echoed through the stone corridors. It was late, well past curfew, and the castle had settled into that peculiar silence that only truly manifested in the deepest hours of the night. The kind of silence that felt alive somehow, punctuated by the occasional creak of shifting staircases and the distant murmur of sleeping portraits. Harry Potter couldn't sleep. He'd been tossing and turning in his four-poster bed for hours, listening to Ron's gentle snores and Neville's occasional sleep-mumbled plant names. His scar hadn't hurt, not exactly, but there was a persistent tingling sensation that refused to let his mind rest. It wasn't pain, but rather a strange awareness, as though something important was trying to make itself known. With a soft sigh, Harry slipped out of bed, his bare feet touching the cool stone floor. He reached for his glasses, sliding them onto his nose before grabbing his wand from beneath his pillow. "Lumos," he whispered, and a gentle light bloomed at the wand's tip, casting long shadows across the dormitory. He padded quietly to Ron's bed, hesitating for just a moment before gently shaking his friend's shoulder. "Ron," he whispered, "wake up." Ron grumbled something unintelligible, burrowing deeper into his blankets before Harry shook him again, a bit more insistently. "What? Harry?" Ron blinked blearily up at him, confusion giving way to immediate concern. "Is everything all right? Is it your scar again?" "No, not exactly," Harry replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something feels off. I think we should get Hermione and check the Marauder's map." Ron groaned but was already sitting up, reaching for his dressing gown. "Mate, it's pouring outside, and whatever hour of the night it is, it's definitely meant for sleeping." "I know," Harry said apologetically, "but I can't explain it. It feels important." They made their way carefully down the spiral staircase to the common room, finding it deserted save for the glowing embers in the fireplace. The rain sounded louder here, lashing against the tall windows, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the room in brief electric bursts. "I'll get Hermione," Harry said, heading toward the girls' staircase before remembering the enchantment. "Actually, you wait here. I'll send her a message." He concentrated, thinking of his happiest memory, flying on his firebolt, the wind in his hair absolutely free. "Expecto Patronum," he whispered, and a silver stag erupted from his wand, prancing silently around the common room before Harry directed it up the girls' staircase, with a whispered message for Hermione. They didn't have to wait long before Hermione appeared, her hair even bushier than usual, wrapped in a thick dressing gown, with her wand clutched tightly in her hand. "This had better be good, Harry," she said, though there was no real annoyance in her voice, just that familiar tone of resigned acceptance that her friends would always find ways to disrupt perfectly good sleeping hours. "I'm not sure if it's good," Harry admitted, "but it feels important." He pulled the Marauder's map from his pocket, tapping it with his wand. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." Ink spread across the parchment like spilled water, forming the detailed map of Hogwarts. The three friends huddled close, their wand light illuminating the countless tiny dots representing the castle's occupants. Most were stationary, confined to dormitories and private quarters. Filch was prowling the third floor with Mrs. Norris close behind. Professor McGonagall was in her office, perhaps catching up on marking. "Everything looks normal," Hermione observed, stifling a yawn. Harry frowned, scanning the map more carefully. "Wait, look here." His finger pointed to a section of the 7th floor, the corridor where the room of requirement was located. There was a strange shimmer on the map, as though the ink was rippling, unable to settle. "I've never seen the map do that before." "The room of requirement doesn't show on the map," Hermione reminded him, but she was leaning closer now, her interest piqued. "But you're right. That's unusual. Maybe the map is trying to show us something that's happening in the room," Ron suggested, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Harry nodded slowly. "I think we should check it out." "In the middle of a thunderstorm," Ron groaned, but he was already standing straighter, his face set with determination. "We'll take the cloak," Harry said, already heading back to the dormitory to retrieve his invisibility cloak. A few minutes later, the three friends were huddled beneath the silvery fabric, making their slow, careful way through the castle's darkened corridors. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, and occasional thunder rumbled in the distance, masking their footsteps. "I still don't understand what we're looking for," Hermione whispered as they climbed yet another staircase. "Neither do I," Harry admitted. "But something feels different tonight. Can't you feel it?" Hermione looked like she was about to dismiss the notion, but then she paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "Actually, there is something. The castle feels more awake than usual, somehow." "Exactly," Harry nodded, "like it's holding its breath." Ron looked between them. "You two have gone completely mental, you know that? Castles don't breathe." But even as he said it, his eyes darted around nervously, as though he too could sense the strange vibration in the air. They reached the 7th floor corridor, and Harry paced 3 times in front of the blank wall, thinking, "We need to see what's causing the disturbance. We need to see what's different tonight. We need to understand what's happening." The door materialized slowly, almost reluctantly, the wood seeming to seep from the stone rather than simply appear. It was different from how the room usually presented itself. Older somehow, with weathered brass fittings that looked ancient even by Hogwarts standards. "That's different," Ron murmured, eyeing the door warily. Harry reached out, his fingers brushing against the aged wood. It felt warm beneath his touch, almost alive. He grasped the handle and pushed, the door swinging open with surprising ease despite its apparent weight. The room beyond was unlike any version they had seen before. Instead of the cluttered, cathedral-like space of hidden things or the practical training room of Dumbledore's army, they were greeted by a small, circular chamber with a domed ceiling. The walls were lined with empty shelves, and the only light came from a solitary object in the center of the room. A lantern. But what a strange lantern it was. It stood about 2 feet tall on a delicate iron stand, its body crafted from what appeared to be smoky crystal or glass. Within, a flame burned steadily, neither blue nor gold, but somewhere in between, casting shifting patterns across the walls and floor. "What is it?" Ron whispered, his voice hushed with awe. "I don't know," Hermione replied, already moving closer, her academic curiosity overriding caution. "I've never seen anything like it before." Harry followed her, drawn to the lantern as though it were calling to him. As they approached, the flame within seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, before settling back to its steady glow. "Be careful," Ron warned, hanging back slightly. Remember what happened with Riddle's diary? Harry nodded, but he couldn't take his eyes off the lantern. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the light moved, not quite flickering but shifting, as though the flame itself were alive. "It's beautiful," Hermione breathed, circling the lantern slowly. "Look at the craftsmanship. Those markings along the base. They look like runes, but not any I've studied." Harry knelt down to examine the base more closely. The markings were indeed strange. Not quite runes, not quite letters, but something in between. And as he stared at them, he realized with a start that they seemed to be moving, rearranging themselves subtly beneath his gaze. "The markings," he said, "they're changing." Hermione knelt beside him, her eyes widening. "You're right, it's as though they're responding to us." Ron finally approached, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "What do you think it does?" As if in answer to his question, the flame within the lantern surged suddenly, growing and brightening until they had to shield their eyes. When they looked again, the light had changed. Instead of illuminating the room directly, it was now projecting shadows. But not of the three friends, or any objects in the room. These shadows moved across the walls independently, forming shapes and scenes that shifted and flowed with an eerie grace. A castle on a hill, a forest with trees that swayed though there was no wind. And then, gradually, people, or rather the shadows of people, engaged in what appeared to be a duel. "It's showing us something," Harry whispered, entranced by the moving shadows. The duel on the wall became more distinct. Two groups faced each other, wands raised. One group wore what appeared to be Hogwarts robes from an earlier era. The cut was different, more formal. The other group wore hooded cloaks, their faces obscured but their stances aggressive, threatening. "Those look like Death Eaters," Ron said, his voice tight with tension. "I don't think so," Hermione replied, squinting at the shadow figures. "The robes are similar, but look at how they're moving, it's different. And this seems old somehow, like we're seeing something from the past." The shadow duel escalated, spells flying between the two groups. The Hogwarts students, for that was clearly what they were, moved with coordination and purpose, working together to counter the attacks of their opponents. One student in particular, taller than the rest with a distinctive stance, seemed to be leading the defense. "They're protecting something," Harry observed, pointing to the way the students had positioned themselves in front of what appeared to be a small object. "See how they're arranged?" The scene shifted, showing the hooded figures retreating, disappearing into shadow while the students remained vigilant, wands still raised. Then the tall student approached the object they had been protecting. A lantern, Harry realized with a jolt. The same lantern that now stood before them. "It's showing us its own history," Hermione breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. The shadows continued to shift and change, showing more scenes. Different groups of students through different eras, always protecting the lantern from those who sought to claim it. Sometimes the threat came from within Hogwarts itself, other times from outside forces. But always the lantern was guarded, kept safe by those who understood its importance. And then, gradually, the scenes became more recent. The robes of the students changed to a style recognizable as modern Hogwarts uniforms. The threats became more distinct, definite Death Eaters now, their skull-like masks visible even in shadow form. "That's recent," Ron said, pointing to a scene where a group of students faced off against Death Eaters in what looked like the Department of Mysteries. "That's us, isn't it? Last year." Harry nodded slowly, recognizing the silhouettes of himself and his friends. But something was off. The scene wasn't quite right. There were subtle differences in positioning, in the spells being cast, and as he watched, he realized with a start that he was seeing not what had happened, but what would happen. "It's not the past anymore," he said quietly. "It's showing us the future." The shadows shifted again, showing a new scene, Hogwarts, but with parts of it in ruins, Death Eaters swarming the grounds, and at the center of it all, 3 familiar silhouettes, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, standing together, facing an indistinct but menacing figure. "Is that?" Ron began, but couldn't finish the thought. "Voldemort," Harry confirmed, his voice barely audible. The shadow wasn't distinct enough to be certain, but he knew, somehow, that was who it represented. The scene played out in silence, the shadow figures moving in a dance of light and dark. Spells flew, people fell, but the 3 central figures remained standing, moving with a coordination that spoke of years of friendship and trust. And gradually, impossibly, they seemed to be gaining ground. Then the lantern showed one final scene, Harry, alone, approaching a cloaked figure. Both had their wands raised, both stood tall and determined. And then, the flame within the lantern suddenly dimmed, the shadows fading from the walls until the room was once again lit only by the soft, steady glow of the lantern itself. "Why did it stop?" Ron asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had fallen. Hermione shook her head, her face pale in the gentle light. "I don't know. Maybe it can only show so much of the future before it becomes too uncertain." Harry was still staring at the spot where the final shadow had been. Himself, facing Voldemort alone. It wasn't surprising, he had always known somehow that it would come down to the 2 of them in the end. But seeing it projected like that, even in shadow form, made it feel more real, more inevitable. "Do you think it's accurate?" he asked quietly. "The future it showed us?" Hermione bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know, Harry. Divination has never been very reliable. Even prophecies are often misinterpreted. But this isn't tea leaves or crystal balls," Ron pointed out. "This is, well, I don't know what it is exactly, but it feels different." Harry nodded slowly, still gazing at the lantern. The flame within seemed to pulse gently, as though responding to his attention. "It feels true," he said simply. "Not necessarily that everything will happen exactly as we saw, but the essence of it. That we'll face Voldemort together. That Hogwarts will be at the center of it all. And that we'll fight," Hermione added, her voice soft but determined. "That we won't give up, no matter how dark things get." "We've always known that," Ron said, attempting a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't need a fancy magic lantern to tell us we're stubborn gits who don't know when to quit." Harry smiled at that, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders. True enough. They stayed silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, the soft glow of the lantern washing over them. The rain outside had begun to ease, the thunder moving further away, leaving only the gentle patter of droplets against the windows. "What do we do with it?" Hermione finally asked, gesturing to the lantern. "We can't just leave it here." "Why not?" Ron asked. "It's been safe in Hogwarts for centuries by the look of things." "But it showed itself to us tonight for a reason," Harry said, his voice thoughtful. "It wanted us to find it, to see what it had to show us." Hermione nodded slowly. "But not too much," Harry added, thinking of how the final scene had cut off before showing the outcome of his confrontation with Voldemort. "Just enough to guide us, not enough to determine our path." "So we leave it here?" Ron asked, looking uncertain. Harry considered for a moment, then nodded. for now. But we'll come back. I think it will show us more when we need to see it." As if in response, the lantern's flame brightened momentarily before settling back to its gentle glow. Harry reached out, his fingers hovering just above the smoky glass, feeling the warmth it radiated. "Thank you," he whispered to the lantern, and though it might have been his imagination, he thought the flame flickered slightly in acknowledgement. They left the room of requirement with reluctance, Harry glancing back at the lantern one last time before closing the door behind them. The corridor outside was quiet, the storm having passed, leaving only the soft sounds of a castle at rest. Under the invisibility cloak once more, they made their slow way back to Gryffindor Tower, each lost in their own thoughts. The rain had stopped completely now, and as they passed a window, Harry saw that the clouds had parted, revealing a sky full of stars. "It's almost dawn," Hermione observed, noting the faint lightening of the horizon. "I'm never going to get back to sleep now," Ron groaned, but without real complaint. There was a thoughtfulness to his expression that suggested his mind was still processing what they had seen. Harry said nothing, his thoughts on the shadows the lantern had shown them. Not just of the battles to come, but of the ones fought by those who had come before. Students just like them, facing darkness with nothing but their wands and their courage. It was a sobering thought, but also oddly comforting. They were not the first to stand against evil, and they would not be the last. As they reached the portrait of the fat lady who was dozing gently in her frame, Harry suddenly understood what he had been feeling all night, why he had been unable to sleep, why he had felt compelled to seek out the source of the disturbance. It wasn't fear or danger that had called to him. It was recognition. The understanding that every generation had its battle to fight, its darkness to face. Now it was their turn, and while the burden was heavy, they did not carry it alone. They had each other, and they had the wisdom of those who had fought before them. The fat lady woke with a start as they approached, grumbling about students out of bed at ungodly hours, but swinging open nonetheless when given the password. The common room was still deserted, the fire now reduced to glowing embers that cast a warm, comforting light across the familiar space. "We should try to get a few hours of sleep," Hermione suggested, though she made no move toward the dormitory stairs, instead sinking into one of the armchairs by the dying fire. Ron joined her, sprawling in the adjacent chair with a yawn that he didn't bother to stifle. "Wake me when it's time for breakfast," he mumbled, his eyes already drooping. Harry smiled, taking the third chair and stretching his legs toward the warmth of the embers. Despite having been awake most of the night, he didn't feel tired. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace settling over him, a certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing, their gentle melodies filtering through the windows along with the soft, golden light of dawn. Harry closed his eyes, listening to the steady breathing of his friends and the quiet crackling of the dying fire. The lantern's shadows lingered in his mind, not as warnings or prophecies, but as reminders. Reminders that light could cast shadows, but shadows could also define light. That darkness was not to be feared, but faced, understood, and ultimately overcome. With these thoughts drifting through his mind like gentle waves, Harry finally felt sleep beginning to claim him. His last conscious thought before surrendering to its embrace was a simple one. Whatever shadows the future held, they would face them together, just as those before them had done. And somehow, in that moment between wakefulness and dreams, that knowledge felt like enough. As Harry drifted off, Far away in the room of requirement, the lantern of shadows continued its silent vigil, its flame steady and unwavering. It had shown what needed to be seen, for now. When the time was right, it would reveal more, guiding those with the courage to look into both the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. For now, it waited, patient as only an object of true magic could be, its light a beacon in the darkness, its shadows a map for the path ahead. Dawn was breaking over Hogwarts, bringing with it a new day and, perhaps, the first whispers of the battles to come. But for this moment, this brief interlude of peace, the castle and its inhabitants rested. The lantern's flame flickered once, twice, and then settled into a steady, comforting glow, casting shadows that danced gently across the walls of its sanctuary, waiting for the time when they would be needed once more. Outside, the world grew lighter, the shadows receding as the sun rose higher in the sky. But inside the room of requirement, the lantern of shadows kept its silent vigil, a keeper of secrets and stories, of battles fought and those yet to come. Its work was not yet done, and would not be until the final shadow was cast, the final story told. Until then, it waited, patient and eternal, its light a promise in the darkness. Where there are shadows, there is also light. Where there is a past, there is also a future. And where there is darkness, there will always be those with the courage to stand against it. The rain had washed away the last remnants of the storm, leaving the grounds of Hogwarts glistening in the early morning light. A new day had begun, bringing with it new challenges, new discoveries, and perhaps new shadows to face. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, between the known and the unknown, there was peace. And somewhere in Gryffindor Tower, 3 friends slept, their dreams filled with shadows and light, with battles fought and won, and with the quiet, unwavering certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, just as the lantern had shown them, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. Dibble. The shadow wasn't distinct enough to be certain, but he knew, somehow, that was who it represented. The scene played out in silence, the shadow figures moving in a dance of light and dark. Spells flew, people fell, but the 3 central figures remained standing, moving with a coordination that spoke of years of friendship and trust. And gradually, impossibly, they seemed to be gaining ground. Then the lantern showed one final scene, Harry, alone, approaching a cloaked figure. Both had their wands raised, both stood tall and determined. And then, the flame within the lantern suddenly dimmed, the shadows fading from the walls, until the room was once again lit only by the soft, steady glow of the lantern itself. "Why did it stop?" Ron asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had fallen. Hermione shook her head, her face pale in the gentle light. "I don't know. Maybe it can only show so much of the future before it becomes too uncertain." Harry was still staring at the spot where the final shadow had been. Himself, facing Voldemort alone. It wasn't surprising. He had always known, somehow, that it would come down to the 2 of them in the end. But seeing it projected like that, even in shadow form, made it feel more real, more inevitable. "Do you think it's accurate?" he asked quietly. "The future it showed us?" Hermione bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know, Harry. Divination has never been very reliable. Even prophecies are often misinterpreted." "But this isn't tea leaves or crystal balls," Ron pointed out. "This is, Well, I don't know what it is exactly, but it feels different. Harry nodded slowly, still gazing at the lantern. The flame within seemed to pulse gently, as though responding to his attention. It feels true, he said simply. Not necessarily that everything will happen exactly as we saw, but the essence of it. That we'll face Voldemort together. That Hogwarts will be at the center of it all. And that we'll fight, Hermione added, her voice soft but determined. That we won't give up, no matter how dark things get. We've always known that, Ron said, attempting a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Didn't need a fancy magic lantern to tell us we're stubborn gits who don't know when to quit. Harry smiled at that, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders. True enough. They stayed silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, the soft glow of the lantern washing over them. The rain outside had begun to ease, the thunder moving further away, leaving only the gentle patter of droplets against the windows. What do we do with it? Hermione finally asked, gesturing to the lantern. We can't just leave it here. Why not? Ron asked. It's been safe in Hogwarts for centuries by the look of things. But it showed itself to us tonight for a reason, Harry said, his voice thoughtful. It wanted us to find it, to see what it had to show us. Hermione nodded slowly. It's preparing us, I think, giving us glimpses of what's to come so we can be ready. But not too much, Harry added, thinking of how the final scene had cut off before showing the outcome of his confrontation with Voldemort. Just enough to guide us, not enough to determine our path. So we leave it here? Ron asked, looking uncertain. Harry considered for a moment, then nodded. For now, but we'll come back, I think. I think it will show us more when we need to see it. As if in response, the lantern's flame brightened momentarily before settling back to its gentle glow. Harry reached out, his fingers hovering just above the smoky glass, feeling the warmth it radiated. Thank you, he whispered to the lantern, and though it might have been his imagination, he thought the flame flickered slightly in acknowledgement. They left the room of requirement with reluctance, Harry glancing back at the lantern one last time before closing the door behind them. The corridor outside was quiet, the storm having passed, leaving only the soft sounds of a castle at rest. Under the invisibility cloak once more, they made their slow way back to Gryffindor Tower, each lost in their own thoughts. The rain had stopped completely now, and as they passed a window, Harry saw that the clouds had parted, revealing a sky full of stars. It's almost dawn, Hermione observed, noting the faint lightening of the horizon. I'm never going to get back to sleep now, Ron groaned, but without real complaint. There was a thoughtfulness to his expression that suggested his mind was still processing what they had seen. Harry said nothing. His thoughts on the shadows the lantern had shown them, not just of the battles to come, but of the ones fought by those who had come before. Students just like them, facing darkness with nothing but their wands and their courage. It was a sobering thought, but also oddly comforting. They were not the first to stand against evil, and they would not be the last. As they reached the portrait of the fat lady who was dozing gently in her frame, Harry suddenly understood what he had been feeling all night, why he had been unable to sleep, why he had felt compelled to seek out the source of the disturbance. It wasn't fear or danger that had called to him. It was recognition. The understanding that every generation had its battle to fight, its darkness to face. Now it was their turn. And while the burden was heavy, they did not carry it alone. They had each other, and they had the wisdom of those who had fought before them. The fat lady woke with a start as they approached, grumbling about students out of bed at ungodly hours, but swinging open nonetheless when given the password. The common room was still deserted, the fire now reduced to glowing embers that cast a warm, comforting light across the familiar space. "We should try to get a few hours of sleep," Hermione suggested, though she made no move toward the dormitory stairs, instead sinking into one of the armchairs by the dying fire. Ron joined her, sprawling in the adjacent chair with a yawn that he didn't bother to stifle. "Wake me when it's time for breakfast," he mumbled, his eyes already drooping. Harry smiled, taking the third chair and stretching his legs toward the warmth of the embers. Despite having been awake most of the night, he didn't feel tired. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace settling over him, a certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing, their gentle melodies filtering through the windows along with the soft golden light of dawn. Harry closed his eyes, listening to the steady breathing of his friends and the quiet crackling of the dying fire. The lantern's shadows lingered in his mind, not as warnings or prophecies, but as reminders. Reminders that light could cast shadows, but shadows could also define light. That darkness was not to be feared, but faced, understood, and ultimately overcome. With these thoughts drifting through his mind like gentle waves, Harry finally felt sleep beginning to claim him. His last conscious thought before surrendering to its embrace was a simple one. Whatever shadows the future held, they would face them together, just as those before them had done. And somehow, in that moment between wakefulness and dreams, that knowledge felt like enough. As Harry drifted off, far away in the room of requirement, the lantern of shadows continued its silent vigil, its flame steady and unwavering. It had shown what needed to be seen, for now, when the time was right, it would reveal more, guiding those with the courage to look into both the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. For now it waited, patient as only an object of true magic could be, its light a beacon in the darkness, its shadows a map for the path ahead. Dawn was breaking over Hogwarts, bringing with it a new day and perhaps the first whispers of the battles to come. But for this moment, this brief interlude of peace, the castle and its inhabitants rested. The lantern's flame flickered once, twice, and then settled into a steady, comforting glow, casting shadows that danced gently across the walls of its sanctuary, waiting for the time when they would be needed once more. Outside, the world grew lighter, the shadows receding as the sun rose higher in the sky. But inside the room of requirement, the lantern of shadows kept its silent vigil, a keeper of secrets and stories, of battles fought and those yet to come. Its work was not yet done, and would not be until the final shadow was cast, the final story told. Until then it waited, patient and eternal, its light a promise in the darkness. Where there are shadows, there is also light. Where there is a past, there is also a future. And where there is darkness, there will always be those with the courage to stand against it. The rain had washed away the last remnants of the storm, leaving the grounds of Hogwarts glistening in the early morning light. A new day had begun, bringing with it new challenges, new discoveries, and perhaps new shadows to face. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, between the known and the unknown, there was peace. And somewhere in Gryffindor Tower, 3 friends slept, their dreams filled with shadows and light, with battles fought and won, and with the quiet, unwavering certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Just as the lantern had shown them, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. Several days had passed since their discovery of the Lantern of Shadows, and Harry found himself thinking about it often. The images it had shown them of past battles fought within Hogwarts walls and the shadow of what was to come lingered in his mind like half-remembered dreams. He had wanted to return to the Room of Requirement to see if the lantern might reveal more, but between classes, homework, and Quidditch practice, there hadn't been time. The early autumn evening had settled gently over the castle grounds, the sky painted in soft strokes of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had retreated to their usual spot by the lake after dinner, seeking a brief respite from the bustling common room. The surface of the water rippled slightly in the cool breeze, reflecting the fading light in shimmering patterns. "Do you think we should tell Dumbledore about the lantern?" Hermione asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled among them. She was leaning against the trunk of an ancient oak tree, a heavy tome on advanced transfiguration open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in some time. Harry shrugged, picking up a smooth stone and skipping it across the water's surface. "I'm not sure. Part of me thinks we should, but then he might take it away," Ron finished for him, understanding in his voice. He was sprawled on the grass, his potions essay forgotten beside him. "And we wouldn't get to see what else it has to show us." Hermione sighed, closing her book with a gentle thud. "I suppose you're right, it's just that sometimes I worry about the things we don't tell the teachers. Remember first year, with the Philosopher's Stone? That worked out all right in the end," Harry pointed out, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Things had, in fact, come dangerously close to not working out at all. As they gathered their things, preparing to return to the castle, Harry noticed something strange at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. A small, silvery light flickered among the trees, almost like a firefly, but larger and more deliberate in its movement. "Look," he said quietly, nodding toward the tree line. "What do you suppose that is?" Ron and Hermione followed his gaze, squinting through the gathering dusk. "Probably just a fairy," Hermione suggested, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "They're quite common in forests like this." "But it's bigger than a fairy," Harry said, taking a step closer to the trees. "And look, there's another one." Sure enough, a second silver spark had appeared, hovering beside the first for a moment before both began to move deeper into the forest, leaving a faint, glimmering trail behind them. "We should go back to the castle," Hermione said, uncertainty evident in her voice. "It's getting dark, and the Forbidden Forest is, well, forbidden." "Since when has that stopped us?" Ron said with a grin, though Harry could tell he was trying to mask his own apprehension. "Besides, it's barely inside the tree line. We'll just take a quick look and then head back." Harry hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. The lantern had shown them shadows of battles to come. Perhaps this was connected somehow, a sign or guide they were meant to follow. Or perhaps it was something far more mundane. Or dangerous. Just a quick look, he decided, drawing his wand. Lumos. The tip of his wand illuminated, casting a gentle white light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. Ron and Hermione followed suit, their wands adding to the glow as they approached the edge of the forest. The silver sparks seemed to be waiting for them, hovering just beyond the first line of trees. As the trio stepped cautiously into the forest, the sparks drifted further in, maintaining the same distance. "Davy wants us to follow them," Harry murmured, stepping over a gnarled root. "Or lure us," Hermione countered, but she continued forward nonetheless, her wand held high to light their path. The forest grew denser as they walked, the trees closer together, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the last vestiges of twilight. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, and charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Harry's neck stand up. The The silver sparks led them along a winding path that didn't appear to have been made by humans, or at least not recently. Brambles occasionally caught at their robes, and more than once they had to duck under low-hanging branches. Yet the path seemed purposeful, not random, as though the sparks were guiding them to a specific destination. "How far do you think we've come?" Ron asked, after they had been walking for what felt like 15 minutes. "Not that far," Hermione answered, glancing back over her shoulder. "I can still make out the lights from the castle through the trees, but far enough that we should be very careful." Harry nodded, his eyes fixed on the silver sparks ahead. They had multiplied now, a dozen or more dancing before them like glowing raindrops suspended in the air. And was it his imagination, or was there a faint sound accompanying them? A soft, musical tinkling, like distant wind chimes. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. Ron and Hermione paused, listening. "Yes," Hermione whispered back. "Like bells or spellwork," Ron suggested. "Magical resonance." Harry and Hermione both turned to look at him in surprise, and he shrugged, his ears turning slightly pink even in the dim light. "What? I do listen sometimes, when you're going on about magical theory, Hermione." Before she could respond, the path ahead of them suddenly opened up into a clearing. The silver sparks rushed forward, spreading out to form a shimmering curtain around a circular space perhaps 30 feet across. As the trio stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath their feet changed from the soft, leaf-strewn forest floor to a surface that felt more solid, almost like stone, though it was covered with a thin layer of mist that swirled around their ankles. The clearing was empty save for a single object at its center, a stone pedestal that stood about waist-high, with a shallow basin carved into its top. Within the basin flickered a flame, not orange or red like normal fire, but a cool silvery blue that matched the sparks that had led them here. "What is this place?" Ron asked, his voice hushed with awe. "I'm not sure," Harry replied, taking a step toward the pedestal, "but it feels familiar somehow." "Be careful, Harry," Hermione warned, her wand still raised. "We don't know what kind of magic this is." As they watched, the mist around their feet began to thicken and rise, swirling more rapidly until it filled much of the clearing. The silvery sparks danced within it, creating strange, shifting patterns that seemed almost like figures moving just at the edge of perception. "I think," Harry began, but he didn't get to finish his sentence. The mist suddenly coalesced, forming a dozen distinct shapes, human-sized, hooded, with blank spaces where faces should be. They stood in a circle around the three friends, silent and menacing. "Death Eaters," Ron breathed, raising his wand higher. But these weren't real Death Eaters, Harry realized after the initial shock passed. They were made of mist and light, semi-perspective and slightly blurred at the edges. Yet they moved with a fluidity and purpose that was unnervingly realistic, their blank faces turning toward the trio with an impression of malice. As one, the misty figures raised their right arms, each holding what appeared to be a wand made of concentrated silver light. "Defensive positions," Harry called out, falling back on the training they had practiced in Dumbledore's army. He, Ron, and Hermione instinctively moved to stand back to back, their wands pointed outward at the encircling figures. "What are they?" Hermione asked, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "I'm not sure," Harry replied, "but I think they're some kind of training simulation, like magical practice dummies but more advanced." No sooner had he spoken than the first misty Death Eater attacked, a bolt of silver light shooting from its wand toward Ron, who barely managed to deflect it with a hastily cast shield charm. The bolt dissipated against Ron's shield with a shower of sparks, but the impact was enough to make him stumble slightly. "They're solid enough," he exclaimed, regaining his balance. Two more figures attacked simultaneously, their spells aimed at Harry and Hermione. Harry ducked and rolled to the side, the silver bolt passing over his head and striking a tree behind him, leaving a scorch mark on the bark. Hermione's shield was stronger than Ron's had been, the spell bouncing off it and back toward its caster, who dissolved momentarily before reforming. "They can be hit by their own spells," she observed, her analytical mind already seeking patterns and weaknesses, even in the midst of danger. The clearing erupted into a silent battle, the misty Death Eaters firing spell after spell while the trio defended themselves. Despite the danger, Harry couldn't help but feel a surge of exhilaration. This was exactly the kind of practical training they needed. Real combat experience without the risk of actual harm. As the battle continued, Harry began to notice that the misty figures moved in distinct, repeating patterns. They would attack in waves, 3 or 4 at a time, while the others held back, waiting. It was almost like a choreographed dance, designed to teach rather than to defeat. "They're not trying to overwhelm us," he called to the others as he ducked another spell. "They're testing us, training us." "That's great and all," Ron shouted back, his face flushed with effort as he cast another shield charm. "But how do we beat them?" "We need to coordinate," Hermione replied, her mind racing ahead. "Harry, remember what we learned in Defense Against the Dark Arts about group combat tactics?" Harry nodded, recalling Professor Moody's, or rather Barty Crouch Jr.'s, lessons on aura tactics. "Triangulate and isolate," he said. "Pick them off one by one." "Exactly," Hermione confirmed. "Ron, focus on defense. Harry and I will target one at a time." Working together, they began to turn the tide of the battle. Hermione would identify a target, Harry would press the attack, and Ron would maintain a shield charm to protect them from counterattacks. One by one, the misty Death Eaters dissolved when struck with particularly powerful spells, though Harry noticed they would reform after a minute or two, rejoining the battle with the same eerily silent determination. "This isn't working," Hermione panted after they had defeated several figures only to see them return. "There must be something else we're missing." Harry glanced around the clearing, his eyes falling on the stone pedestal with its silver moon flame. "The pedestal," he said suddenly. "That's controlling them. We need to get to it." But reaching the pedestal proved challenging. The misty Death Eaters seemed to anticipate their intention, forming a tight ring around the stone structure, their wands raised defensively. "We need a distraction," Harry said, his mind racing through possible strategies. "I've got an idea," Ron replied, a new determination in his voice. "Cover me." Before Harry or Hermione could ask what he planned to do, Ron broke from their formation, charging directly at the line of misty figures. They turned to focus on him, silver bolts of magic shooting from their wands. "Run!" Hermione cried in alarm. But Ron was moving with a confidence Harry had rarely seen in him, deflecting spells with precise shield charms and even sending some back at their casters. It was as though all his fear had burned away, replaced by a cool, tactical focus. "Now," he shouted to Harry and Hermione, "while they're focused on me." Harry grabbed Hermione's hand, and they sprinted toward the pedestal, taking advantage of the gap Ron had created in the Death Eater's line. Two figures turned to intercept them, but Hermione was ready. "Stupefy!" she cast, her spell hitting one of the misty forms directly in the chest, causing it to dissolve temporarily. Harry followed with a disarming charm that sent the other's wand flying before it too dissolved. They reached the pedestal, the silver moon flame flickering wildly as they approached, as though sensing their presence. What do we do? Hermione asked, her eyes scanning the stone structure for clues. There must be some way to control it. Harry studied the pedestal, noticing for the first time that there were runes carved around its edge, similar to those on the Lantern of Shadows they had found days earlier. But these were clearer, more defined, and somehow familiar. I recognize these, he said, tracing one with his finger. It's from the textbook Lupin gave me. They're defensive runes, used in aura training grounds. So this is an aura training simulation, Hermione breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. But who would set this up in the Forbidden Forest? Someone from the Order, maybe, Harry suggested, still examining the runes. As extra protection for the castle, or as training for us. A shout from Ron drew their attention back to the battle. He was still holding his own against the misty Death Eaters, but his movements were becoming slower, his spells less precise. He couldn't keep up the distraction much longer. We need to shut this down, Harry said urgently, turning back to the pedestal. There should be a deactivation rune somewhere. Hermione's eyes darted over the carved symbols, her extensive knowledge of ancient runes coming to the fore. There, she said after a moment, pointing to a symbol near the base of the pedestal. That's the rune for cessation, or ending. But I think it needs to be activated with a spell. Harry nodded, pointing his wand at the rune. Finite incantatum, he tried, but nothing happened. No, that's too general, Hermione said, biting her lip in concentration. It needs to be something specific to training or practice. Terminus exercitium, she said suddenly, aiming her wand at the rune. The ending of practice. The rune glowed briefly, but the flame continued to burn and the misty Death Eaters still pressed their attack on Ron. It's not strong enough, Harry realized. We both need to cast it together. They raised their wands in unison, focusing on the rune. Terminus exercium, they cast together, their voices blending into one command. This time the rune flared with bright silver light, spreading to the other symbols around the pedestal. The flame in the basin flickered violently, then transformed, changing from silver blue to a warm, gentle gold. As it did, the misty Death Eaters froze in place, then slowly dissolved, the silver particles that had formed them floating upward into the night sky like stars returning to the heavens. Ron staggered toward them, breathing heavily but grinning with the exhilaration of battle. That, he panted, was brilliant. Hermione rushed to him, checking for injuries, but finding only minor scrapes and a few spots where the silver spells had left cold burns that were already fading. You were brilliant, she told him, her voice warm with admiration. I've never seen you duel like that before. Ron's ears turned pink with pleasure at her praise. Well, I figured someone had to be the distraction, and I've got 5 older brothers. Dodging things being thrown at me is practically a survival skill in my family. Harry smiled at his friends, then turned back to the pedestal. The flame was now burning steadily, casting a warm golden glow over the clearing that felt welcoming rather than threatening. I still don't understand who set this up, he said, studying the rune-covered stone, or why it activated when we approached. As if in answer to his question, a new figure began to form before them, not from mist this time, but from the golden light of the flame itself. Unlike the featureless Death Eaters, this figure had a distinct face, though it was semi-paraboyan and slightly blurred, like an old photograph come to life. Harry recognized him immediately, though he had only seen him in pictures and in the brief moment when the shadows of his parents had emerged from Voldemort's wand during the duel in the graveyard. Sirius, he whispered, his heart constricting with a mixture of joy and pain. The golden figure of Sirius Black nodded, a familiar smile spreading across his face. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from all around them, as though the entire clearing was speaking. "Hello, Harry," Sirius said, his voice warm but distant, like an echo from across a great divide. "If you're seeing this, then you've found my little training ground and passed the first test." "First test?" Ron repeated, his eyebrows rising in surprise. The figure of Sirius chuckled, though of course it couldn't hear them. This was clearly a pre-recorded magical message triggered by their successful deactivation of the training simulation. "I set this up last summer before..." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Well, before everything that happened at the Ministry. Dumbledore suggested we create some additional protection around Hogwarts, and I thought, why not make it educational as well? So with his help, I designed this training ground, based on the ones we used during the First War against Voldemort." Harry listened intently, drinking in the sight and sound of his godfather, even in this spectral form. The silver sparks will only appear to those who truly need the training, those who have faced dark wizards before and will likely do so again. "They're drawn to courage and determination," Sirius continued. "The simulation itself is designed to adapt to your skills, becoming more challenging as you improve. It's not just for combat practice, though that's important. It's also to teach you to work together, to rely on each other's strengths." The golden figure gazed around at them, his expression growing more serious. "The war that's coming won't be won by individual heroes, Harry. It will be won by friends standing together, by trust and love and sacrifice. Remember that." Sirius's expression softened again, a mischievous glint appearing in his spectral eyes. "But enough of the serious talk. I'm supposed to be the fun godfather after all. You've done well to find this place and overcome its challenges. The training ground is now yours to use as you see fit. Just tap the activation rune," he pointed to a symbol on the side of the pedestal, "and speak the words Incipio Exequitium to begin a new session. You can adjust the difficulty by adding a number from 1 to 10 after the incantation." The golden figure began to fade slightly, his time apparently growing short. "One last thing," Sirius said, his voice becoming more distant. "There are other training grounds hidden around Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, each with different lessons to teach. Find them all, master their challenges, and you'll be as prepared as I can make you for what lies ahead." He smiled once more, a smile full of pride and love. "I believe in you, Harry. All of you. More than you know." With those final words, the golden figure dissolved completely, particles of light drifting back into the flame in the basin, which dimmed to a steady, gentle glow. For a long moment, none of them spoke, the echo of Sirius's voice still seeming to linger in the air around them. Harry felt a lump in his throat, a complicated mixture of emotions welling up inside him. Grief for his lost godfather, gratitude for this final gift, and a renewed determination to live up to the faith Sirius had placed in him. Hermione was the first to break the silence, placing a gentle hand on Harry's shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak just yet. He reached up to touch her hand briefly in appreciation, then moved closer to the pedestal, examining the activation rune Sirius had pointed out. "So we can come back and practice whenever we want," Ron said, joining them by the pedestal. "That's brilliant, especially with the DA not meeting officially anymore. We should keep it between us for now," Hermione suggested, "at least until we understand more about these training grounds and what they're designed to teach." Harry finally found his voice. "Sirius said there are others hidden around the castle and village. We should try to find them all." "We will," Ron assured him, clapping a hand on his back. "Starting tomorrow, but for now we should probably head back before someone notices we're missing." Harry nodded, reluctantly turning away from the pedestal and the last gift from his godfather. As they prepared to leave, he noticed that the silvery sparks had reappeared, but now they were forming a clear path back toward the edge of the forest, guiding them home. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, the forest less intimidating than it had been on their way in. Perhaps it was because they were following a defined path, or perhaps it was the lingering sense of Sirius's presence, watching over them. As they emerged from the tree line, the castle of Hogwarts rose before them, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled out across the grounds. It was later than they had realized, the sky fully dark now and scattered with stars. "We're going to have to be careful getting back in," Hermione whispered as they crossed the open ground toward the castle. "It's definitely past curfew." "The invisibility cloak is in my bag," Harry said, patting the satchel he had brought with him to the lake earlier. "It'll be a tight fit for all three of us now, but we should manage." Before they reached the castle steps, however, a tall figure stepped out of the shadows to intercept them. For a heart-stopping moment, Harry thought they had been caught by Filch or Snape, but then the figure's identity became clear in the light spilling from the entrance hall. "Professor Lupin," Hermione exclaimed in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Remus Lupin, looking as shabby and careworn as ever, but with a gentle smile on his face, stepped closer to them. "Good evening," he greeted them. "I might ask you three the same question, though I suspect I already know the answer." Harry glanced at his friends, then back at Lupin. "You know about the training ground," he said. It wasn't a question. Lupin nodded, his smile turning slightly sad. "I helped Sirius design it. He was determined to do something to prepare you, even while he was confined to Grimmauld Place. It gave him purpose during those dark days." "We saw him," Harry said quietly. "Well, not him exactly, but a recording, a message he left." "Ah," Lupin's expression softened with understanding. "The successful completion protocol. I wondered if he'd included that." He studied Harry's face for a moment, then added gently, "He was very proud of you, Harry, all of you." Harry nodded, unable to speak past the lump that had returned to his throat. "But now," Lupin continued, glancing toward the castle, "we should get you inside before Professor McGonagall or, heaven forbid, Professor Snape discovers you out after hours. I've been asked to resume some special defense against the dark arts lessons with students who show particular aptitude, so my presence here tonight is perfectly legitimate. You three, on the other hand? We're just getting some extra tutoring from you," Ron suggested with a grin. Lupin chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "A reasonable cover story, Mr. Weasley, though perhaps we should save it for if we're actually caught. For now, let's simply try to avoid detection altogether." With Lupin escorting them, they managed to re-enter the castle without incident. He guided them along less traveled corridors and through hidden passages that Harry hadn't even known existed, despite his familiarity with the Marauder's map. "The training ground you found tonight focuses on combat against multiple opponents," Lupin explained quietly as they walked. "Working together, strategy, identifying patterns of attack. The others each have their own emphasis: stealth, problem-solving, endurance. Sirius was particularly proud of the one that teaches resistance to mind-altering magic like the Imperius Curse." "How many are there in total?" Hermione asked, fascinated despite her exhaustion. 7, Lupin replied, "a magically significant number, each more challenging than the last, but each with its own important lessons." They had reached the corridor leading to the Gryffindor Tower. Lupin paused, turning to face them. "I should leave you here," he said, "but before I do, I want to emphasize what I'm sure Sirius already told you. These training grounds are designed to prepare you, not just in magical skill, but in how to work together. how to trust each other. The challenges ahead will require all of your strengths combined. Harry nodded, thinking of what the Lantern of Shadows had shown them, the battles to come, the darkness that would need to be faced. We understand, Professor. Lupin smiled again, the lines of worry on his face softening slightly. I know you do, Harry, and please, outside of class, I think you've all earned the right to call me Remus. With a final nod of farewell, he turned and disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps fading into silence. The common room was mostly empty when they finally entered through the portrait hole, just a few seventh years still up studying for their NEW. They found a quiet corner away from the others and sank into armchairs, the events of the evening catching up with them. 7 training grounds, Ron said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen among them, each teaching something different, and all created by Sirius and Professor Lupin specifically for us. For anyone who needs them, Hermione corrected gently. But yes, primarily for us, I think. Harry stared into the dying embers of the fire, his thoughts drifting between the Lantern of Shadows and the training ground they had discovered tonight. They're preparing us, he said quietly. The lantern shows us what we'll face, and the training grounds teach us how to face it. Do you think they're connected? Hermione asked, sitting forward slightly. The lantern and the training grounds? Harry considered this. I don't know. The lantern felt older, more ancient, but they could be linked in purpose, if not in origin. Ron yawned widely, stretching his arms above his head. Well, whatever they are, they're bloody useful. That was the most realistic dueling practice we've ever had. And you were amazing, Hermione told him again, a hint of pink touching her cheeks. The way you held off all those illusory Death Eaters by yourself. Ron's ears turned red with pleasure, but he tried to shrug it off. It was just instinct, really, and knowing you two would figure out how to deactivate the simulation. That's the point, though, isn't it? Harry said, a small smile forming on his lips. Each of us bringing our strengths to the table. You've always been the best at the practical aspects of magic, Ron. Quick reflexes, good instincts. And Hermione, your knowledge of spells and runes is what allowed us to shut it down. And you, Hermione added, looking at Harry, you're the leader, the one who sees what needs to be done and makes it happen. Harry shook his head, slightly uncomfortable with the label. I don't try to be a leader. That's why you're good at it, Ron said simply. You don't do it for the glory or because you want to be in charge. You do it because it needs doing. Harry didn't know how to respond to that, so he just gazed back into the fire, watching the last embers glow red and gold in the darkness. As they parted at the staircases leading to the boys' and girls' dormitories, Harry felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The discoveries of the Lantern of Shadows, and now Sirius's training ground, had changed something, shifted the balance somehow. Where before he had felt the weight of prophecy and expectation pressing down on him alone, now he felt supported, prepared, or at least prepared. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else since that first day on the Hogwarts Express, when a shy, bespectacled boy with a lightning scar had met a freckled boy with dirt on his nose and a bushy-haled girl searching for a toad. Harry climbed the spiral staircase to his dormitory, careful not to wake his sleeping roommates as he changed into his pajamas and slipped into bed. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of Ron's light snoring and Neville's occasional sleep murmurs about plants, his thoughts drifted once more to the golden figure of Sirius and his final message. I believe in you, Harry, all of you, more than you know. With those words echoing in his mind, Harry closed his eyes and let sleep claim him. and if he dreamed of silver sparks guiding him through dark forests and golden flames lighting his way home, well, there were certainly worse dreams to have. In the forbidden forest, the training ground lay quiet and still under the starlight, the pedestal's flame burning low but steady, waiting for their return. And throughout Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, 6 more such grounds lay hidden, each with its own challenges and lessons, patient as only magical things could be, ready to teach those with the courage to find them. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it the bustle and brightness of a new day at Hogwarts. There would be classes to attend, homework to complete, Quidditch to practice. But beneath the ordinary rhythms of school life, something else was stirring now. A sense of purpose, of preparation, a quiet determination that, when the shadows the lantern had shown them finally came, they would be ready. Not simply because they were brave, though they were. Not simply because they were skilled, though they were becoming more so. But because they had each other, and that, in the end, might prove to be the most powerful magic of all. The soft patter of rain against the dormitory windows had continued for 3 days, casting a drowsy spell over Hogwarts Castle. The grounds had turned to mud, the sky remained a canvas of shifting greys, and even the suits of armor lining the corridors seemed to droop with the weight of persistent dampness. It was the kind of weather that made the stone walls feel colder, the fires burn brighter, and the common rooms more inviting than ever. Harry sat on the windowsill of the Gryffindor common room, watching droplets trace lazy patterns down the glass. Behind him, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the crimson and gold tapestries that adorned the walls. The room was nearly empty. Most students had retreated to their dormitories after dinner, seeking the warmth of their beds on such a dreary evening. Ron and Hermione sat nearby, Ron sprawled in an armchair with a half-finished Transfiguration essay forgotten on his lap, Hermione cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open books, a quill moving steadily across a length of parchment already filled with her neat handwriting. The 3 friends had fallen into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as the rain whispered against the windows. "It's been 2 weeks," Harry said quietly, not turning from the window, "since we found Sirius's training ground." Ron looked up, stifling a yawn. "And a week since we last used it. I still have bruises from those misty Death Eaters. We should go back soon," Hermione said, not pausing in her writing. "Professor Remus, said there were 6 more training grounds hidden around the castle and Hogsmeade, and we've only found 1. We need to train more if we're going to be ready." Ready for what, she didn't say, but she didn't need to. The Lantern of Shadows had shown them enough battles to come, darkness closing in. The weight of what lay ahead seemed to press more heavily on Harry with each passing day. "Tomorrow, maybe," he said, turning from the window at last, "if the rain stops." A sudden flash of silver light by the fireplace drew their attention. Harry stood quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his wand, but relaxed as he recognized the form materializing before them. A silver lynx, its outline shimmering like moonlight on water. "Kingsley's Patronus," Hermione whispered, setting down her quill. The lynx opened its mouth, and when it spoke, it was indeed with Kingsley Shacklebolt's deep, resonant voice, though quieter than usual, as though he were whispering directly into their ears. "Information suggests Death Eater operative in Hogsmeade tonight. Identity unknown. Order members outnumbered. Cannot approach directly. Your proximity an advantage if you choose to assist. Extreme caution advised. If engaged, signal for backup. Message ends." The silver links dissolved into mist, leaving the three friends staring at each other in the flickering firelight. The suddenness of the message had broken the evening's tranquility, replacing it with a familiar tension that pulled at Harry's chest. "Why would he contact us?" Ron asked, his essay sliding forgotten to the floor. "There must be other Order members closer than we are." "Maybe not," Hermione said thoughtfully, closing the largest of her books with a soft thud. "Most of them are on assignments. Tonks is up north tracking suspected werewolf packs working with Voldemort. Moody's in London with Kingsley, and we do have a certain history of finding trouble. Or having it find us," Harry muttered. But his mind was already racing ahead. "We need to get to Hogsmeade." "Tonight?" Ron's eyebrows shot up. "Without permission? In the rain?" "Yes, tonight," Harry said, already moving toward the dormitory stairs. "If there's a Death Eater in Hogsmeade, people could be in danger. And Kingsley wouldn't have contacted us if he didn't think we could help." "He also said extreme caution," Hermione reminded him, but she was already gathering her books, her expression resolute. "We'll need the invisibility cloak." "And the Marauder's map," Ron added, pushing himself out of his chair with a sigh. "I was hoping to get some sleep tonight." They agreed to meet in the common room in 10 minutes. Harry hurried up to his dormitory, where he found Neville, Dean, and Seamus already asleep, their breathing creating a soft symphony of snores and sighs. Moving quietly, he retrieved his invisibility cloak from his trunk and picked up the Marauder's map from his bedside table. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," he whispered, tapping the map with his wand. Ink bloomed across the parchment, revealing the detailed layout of Hogwarts Castle and the location of every person within its walls. Harry scanned the map quickly, checking for teachers or prefects who might be patrolling the corridors between Gryffindor Tower and the One-Eyed Witch Passage. Filch was in his office with Mrs. Norris. Professor McGonagall was in her study. The path looked clear. Back in the common room, Ron and Hermione were waiting. Ron had changed into a dark sweater and jeans, and Hermione had put on a pair of sensible boots, perfect for navigating the muddy streets of Hogsmeade. Her beaded bag hung from her shoulder, no doubt containing an assortment of items she deemed essential for their mission. "Ready?" Harry asked, unfolding the invisibility cloak. It felt slightly damp from the humid air, the silvery material heavier than usual. "As will ever be," Ron replied, ducking under the cloak as Harry held it up. The three of them pressed close together, making sure the cloak covered them completely. It was a tighter fit than it had been in their first year. They had all grown taller, especially Ron, but they managed to make it work with a bit of stooping and careful footwork. They left the common room, the fat lady swinging open with a curious "who's there" that they didn't answer. The corridors were quiet and dimly lit, the torches burning low at this hour. Their footsteps, muffled as they tried to be, seemed impossibly loud in the silence, echoing slightly off the stone walls. Harry kept his eyes on the Marauder's map as they walked, watching for any movement that might indicate a teacher or Filch changing their patrol route. But the castle remained still, most of its inhabitants asleep, or at least in their designated rooms. 20 minutes later, the three friends huddled beneath the invisibility cloak at the entrance to the One-Eyed Witch Passage that would take them to Honeyduke's cellar. The corridors had been mercifully empty, though they had encountered nearly headless Nick, who had drifted past without noticing them, muttering something about the indignity of it all as he adjusted his partially severed head. "Discendium," Harry whispered, tapping the witch's hump with his wand. The stone slid aside, revealing the dark passage beyond. One by one, they slipped inside, the hump closing silently behind them. "Lumos," Hermione murmured, her wand light illuminating the narrow tunnel ahead. It was damp and chilly, the earthen walls slick with moisture from the persistent rain above. The passage stretched ahead of them, disappearing into darkness. "We should have a plan before we reach Hogsmeade," Hermione said as they began walking, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "We can't just wander around hoping to spot a Death Eater, especially since we don't know who we're looking for." Ron agreed, his voice low. "Could be anyone. Could be someone polyjuiced to look like a local." Harry frowned, thinking, Kingsley said operative, not just Death Eater. That makes me think spy. Someone gathering information rather than attacking outright. "That makes sense," Hermione nodded. "If they were planning an attack, the Order would have sent more than just a message. They would have come themselves, or at least given us specific instructions." "So, we're looking for someone watching, listening, maybe following people," Ron summarized, ducking to avoid a low-hanging root. "Still doesn't narrow it down much." The passage continued its gentle descent beneath the grounds of Hogwarts, taking them further from the castle and closer to the village of Hogsmeade. The air grew cooler the deeper they went, and the walls seemed to press in more closely, as though the very earth were reluctant to let them pass. "We'll need disguises," Harry decided as they continued down the passage. "If there's a Death Eater spy in Hogsmeade, they might recognize us, especially me." Hermione stopped suddenly, causing Ron to bump into her from behind. "I have an idea," she said, rummaging in her small beaded bag. After a moment of searching, she pulled out 3 small vials containing a muddy-looking potion. "Polyjuice potion?" Ron asked incredulously. "You just happen to be carrying that around?" Hermione shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "After everything that's happened, I thought it might be useful to have some prepared. I've been working on it in Myrtle's bathroom for weeks." "Brilliant," Harry said sincerely, "but we need hair from someone to transform into." "Already taken care of," Hermione replied, pulling out 3 small envelopes. "I've collected samples from some of the older Ravenclaws. They don't interact with us much, so no one should notice anything odd about their behavior." "You're scary sometimes, you know that?" Ron said, but he took the envelope and vial she handed him with a grin of admiration. They continued down the passage, planning their approach as they went. By the time they reached the trapdoor leading into the Honeyduke's cellar, they had a rough strategy in place. "Remember," Harry whispered as they prepared to climb up into the sweet shop. "We're just observing. No magic unless absolutely necessary. It could alert the Death Eater. And we don't want to start a duel in the middle of the village. We watch, we listen, and we report back to the Order." Ron and Hermione nodded their understanding. One by one they climbed through the trapdoor, emerging into the dark cellar of Honeyduke's. The shop was closed for the night, boxes of sweets stacked high around them, the air thick with the scent of chocolate and caramel. Even in the darkness, they could make out the shapes of barrels filled with every flavor beans, shelves stocked with chocolate frogs, and display cases ready to be filled with fresh fudge in the morning. "Add the hairs now," Hermione instructed in a whisper, opening her envelope and dropping a strand of dark hair into her vial. The potion hissed and turned a deep midnight blue. Ron's became a swirling bronze color, while Harry's shifted to a pale violet. "Bottoms up," Ron murmured, and they all drank. The familiar sensation of Polyjuice potion taking effect washed over Harry, his skin bubbling like hot wax, his bones stretching and compressing. It wasn't pleasant, but it was over quickly, and he found himself several inches taller, with longer arms and a distinctly different center of gravity. His vision blurred momentarily as his eye prescription changed, and then cleared again. In the dim wand light, he could see that Ron had transformed into a stocky, square-jawed boy with closely cropped hair. while Hermione was now a willowy girl with elegantly braided black hair. She was already adjusting their clothing with a quick spell, ensuring everything fit their new forms. "We've got an hour, maybe less," she reminded them. "Let's make it count." They made their way cautiously up the stairs and out through the back door of Honeydukes, Hermione's Alohomora charm unlocking it silently. The rain had finally stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture, a fine mist hanging over the village. The moon was nearly full, its silver light diffused through the clouds, casting everything in a ghostly, ethereal glow. Hogsmeade was quiet, most shops closed for the night, though light and the muffled sounds of conversation spilled from the windows of the Three Broomsticks further down the main street. Water dripped from eaves and gutters, forming puddles that reflected the moonlight like scattered silver coins. The cobblestone streets glistened wetly, and the air was filled with the clean, fresh scent of rain. "Where do we start?" Ron asked, his voice now deeper than usual. "Let's split up," Harry suggested. "We can cover more ground that way. Ron, you take the north end of the village near the Hog's Head. Hermione, you check around the post office and Scriven Shafts. I'll watch the Three Broomsticks and the main square." Hermione looked uncertain. "I don't think we should separate. If one of us finds something..." "We'll use these," Harry said, pulling 3 small, smooth stones from his pocket. They were ordinary river stones, but each had been enchanted with a protean charm, similar to the ones Hermione had used for the DA's coins. "If you see anything suspicious, rub the stone 3 times. The others will grow warm." "Clever," Ron said, taking one of the stones and slipping it into his pocket. "Remember," Hermione cautioned, "we're just observing. Don't approach anyone suspicious directly, and meet back here in 45 minutes, no matter what." They parted ways, each heading toward their assigned area. Harry moved down the main street, trying to adopt a casual demeanor despite the tension coiling in his chest. The cobblestones were slick with rain, and he walked carefully, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The Three Broomsticks were still doing a lively trade despite the late hour. Through the windows, Harry could see Madame Rosmerta moving between tables, carrying trays of butterbeers and fire whiskey to the pub's patrons. A burst of laughter occasionally broke through the general murmur of conversation when the door opened to admit or release a customer. Harry positioned himself across the street, beneath the awning of Zonko's joke shop, where he could observe without being obvious. The joke shop was closed, its windows dark, but the overhang provided shelter from the light mist that had begun to fall again. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the Three Broomsticks' entrance and much of the main street. For several minutes, nothing seemed amiss. A few wizards came and went from the pub, their cloaks drawn tight against the damp night air. An elderly witch with a covered basket shuffled past, muttering to herself. A cat darted across the street, its tail high, disappearing down an alley. Then Harry noticed something odd. A figure stood at the corner where the main street met a narrow side lane. A wizard in a dark traveling cloak, the hood pulled up despite the rain having stopped. He wasn't moving toward any destination, just standing, watching. Occasionally he would shift position slightly, as though trying to appear casual, but his attention seemed fixed on the Three Broomsticks. Harry's instincts prickled with suspicion. He moved a little closer, pretending to be examining the window display at Zonko's while keeping the hooded figure in his peripheral vision. There was something about the way the person stood, tense, alert, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. As if sensing Harry's scrutiny, the figure suddenly turned, looking directly at him. Harry quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be deeply interested in a display of Hickok's sweets. When he dared to look back, The hooded figure was moving away, heading down the side lane at a brisk pace. Without thinking, Harry followed, keeping a careful distance. The lane was narrow, lined with the backs of shops and a few small cottages. The moonlight barely penetrated here, and Harry had to move carefully to avoid tripping on the uneven cobblestones. The mist seemed thicker in these narrow confines, swirling around his ankles and obscuring the path ahead. The hooded figure moved with purpose, turning left at a fork in the lane, then right at the next. Harry realized they were circling back toward the main square, but coming at it from behind the shops. He quickened his pace slightly, not wanting to lose sight of his quarry. As he rounded the next corner, Harry froze. The lane ahead was empty, the hooded figure had vanished. Heart racing, Harry scanned the surroundings. There were a few doorways, a couple of narrow passages between buildings, but no sign of the person he'd been following. Had they apparated away? Gone into one of the buildings? The silence of the lane was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds from the 3 broomsticks and the soft plip-plop of water dripping from the eaves. Harry's breathing seemed unnaturally loud in his own ears as he strained to detect any sound that might indicate where the hooded figure had gone. A reflection in a rain puddle caught his eye, a shadow moving where no one stood. Harry spun around, but the lane behind him was empty too. Then he heard it, the soft scuff of a boot on stone, coming from somewhere ahead but slightly to the left. Cautiously, Harry moved forward, every sense alert. The sound had come from a narrow passage between a bookbinder's shop and what appeared to be a private residence. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, and it was almost completely dark. Drawing a deep breath, Harry stepped into the passage. The walls were close on either side, the air cooler and damper here, smelling of mold and old stone. He moved slowly, one hand trailing along the rough wall for guidance, his other hand keeping a firm grip on his wand inside his pocket. The passage opened onto a small courtyard, enclosed on all sides by the backs of buildings. It was paved with the same cobblestones as the lanes, but years of neglect had allowed moss to grow between them. An old well stood in the center, its wooden cover rotting and sagging. And there, on the far side of the courtyard, the hooded figure stood, watching, as though waiting for Harry. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Harry's hand twitched toward his wand, but remembered Hermione's warning about not using magic. The hooded figure made no aggressive move, simply standing there, observing. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure raised a hand and pulled back the hood. Harry stifled a gasp of surprise. The face revealed by the moonlight was familiar. Mundungus Fletcher, his unshaven face lined with age and drink, his bloodshot eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Been following me, have you?" Mundungus said, his voice a low rasp. "Thought you were being clever, didn't you? Well, 2 can play at that game." "I wasn't," Harry began, before remembering he was disguised as a Ravenclaw student Mundungus wouldn't know. He changed tack. "I saw you watching the 3 broomsticks. What are you doing here?" Mundungus snorted. "I could ask you the same thing. Bit late for students to be wandering the village, isn't it?" His hand moved to his pocket and Harry tensed, but Mundungus merely pulled out a pipe, which he proceeded to stuff with tobacco. "Unless you're not really who you appear to be." Harry's mind raced. Could Mundungus be the Death Eater spy Kingsley had warned them about? It seemed unlikely. Mundungus was a known quantity to the Order, despite his somewhat shady dealings. But then again, his loyalties had always been primarily to himself, and he was certainly acting suspicious tonight. "I'm just heading back to the castle," Harry said, trying to sound casual. "Took a wrong turn." Mundungus lit his pipe with the tip of his wand, the brief flare illuminating his skeptical expression. Through a courtyard with no exit except the way you came in? Must be a very wrong turn indeed. He took a long pull on his pipe, the smoke curling around his head like ghostly fingers in the misty air. Harry was beginning to back away when he felt the stone in his pocket grow warm. Ron or Hermione had seen something suspicious. He needed to get back to them. "Well, good night then," he said, turning to leave. "Not so fast," Mundungus called, and there was something in his tone that made Harry pause. "You're not the only one pretending to be someone you're not tonight. There's others about with secrets to hide. Best watch yourself." With that cryptic warning, Mundungus pulled his hood back up and moved toward the passage Harry had just come through. Harry stepped aside to let him pass, his mind whirling with questions. Was Mundungus warning him? About what? And if he knew Harry was disguised, did that mean he knew who Harry really was? As soon as Mundungus was gone, Harry rubbed his own stone 3 times, signaling to the others. Then he hurried back through the passage and into the lane, intent on returning to their meeting point. The mist had thickened, swirling around his ankles as he walked, muffling his footsteps. The moon had risen higher, its light stronger now, casting sharp shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Harry had just turned onto the main street when he noticed something odd. His shadow was wrong. It stretched out before him on the wet cobblestones, but it seemed too long, too dark, and it moved not quite in sync with his own movements. A second shadow overlapping his own. He was being followed. Without looking back, Harry quickened his pace slightly, his hand closing around his wand in his pocket. He needed to get back to Ron and Hermione. Together they could handle whatever this was. The stone in his pocket was still warm, pulsing slightly as though in time with a heartbeat. His friends had seen something too, but were they in danger? Were they being followed as well? Harry risked a quick glance over his shoulder. The street behind him appeared empty, but the shadows between buildings were deep, offering plenty of hiding places. He turned forward again and nearly collided with someone standing directly in his path. "In a hurry?" asked a soft, silky voice. Harry stepped back, startled. Before him stood a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair, wearing expensive-looking robes of deep green. He didn't recognize her, but something about her bearing set off warning bells in his mind. "Just heading back to the castle?" Harry said, moving to step around her. "Are you indeed?" the woman said, matching his movement to block his path again. "Curious. I was just speaking with Headmistress McGonagall not 2 hours ago, and she mentioned all students were accounted for tonight. Due to the weather, you see." Harry's mouth went dry. "I have special permission," he improvised. The woman smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you? How fascinating. And would this special permission extend to your friends as well? The red-haired boy near the Hog's Head, and the girl lurking by the post office?" So she had been watching them. But how had she known they were together? Unless she'd been following all 3 of them, moving between them, observing their patterns. But that would require exceptional skill. Or, "You're not alone," Harry realized aloud. "There are more of you." The woman's smile widened fractionally. "Clever boy, but not clever enough, I think. You see, you've walked into something far beyond your capabilities. The question now is, what am I to do with you?" Harry's fingers tightened around his wand, but before he could decide whether to draw it, the woman's attention was diverted by something over his shoulder. Her expression hardened, and she stepped back slightly. "Another time, perhaps," she said, and with a swirl of her cloak, she turned and walked swiftly away, disappearing into the mist that now clung to the village like a shroud. Harry spun around, half expecting to see an Order member who had frightened her off, but the street remained empty. Whatever the woman had seen, or thought she had seen, it wasn't immediately apparent to him. Heart racing, Harry hurried toward Honeydukes, where they had agreed to meet. The stone in his pocket had stopped warming, which he hoped meant Ron and Hermione were no longer in immediate danger. He reached the meeting point first and pressed himself into the shadows beside the sweet shop's back door, watching the streets anxiously for his friends. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, he spotted Ron's stocky, transformed figure approaching cautiously from the direction of the Hog's Head. "Harry," Ron whispered as he drew near. "Over here," Harry replied softly, stepping slightly out of the shadows so Ron could see him. Ron hurried over, his expression tense. "I think I saw Yaxley," he said without preamble. At least, it looked like him from the wanted posters. He was talking to someone outside the Hog's Head, but I couldn't get close enough to hear what they were saying. "I ran into Mundungus Fletcher," Harry told him, "and then a woman I didn't recognize stopped me on the main street. She knew we were here, Ron. She mentioned you and Hermione specifically." Ron paled slightly. "Death Eaters? I'm not sure about the woman, but she definitely wasn't friendly. And if Yaxley's here..." They both fell silent as footsteps approached, relaxing only when they recognized Hermione's transformed silhouette. "Something's happening," she said urgently as she joined them. "I saw at least 3 suspicious people meeting near Dervish and Banges. They were talking about a package, something important being moved tonight." "Did you hear where?" Harry asked. Hermione shook her head. "They were careful, but I think it's happening soon. And Harry, one of them mentioned your name." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Harry's spine. "We need to get back to the castle," he decided. "Contact the Order, let them know what we've found." "But the package," Hermione began. "Could be a trap," Ron interrupted. "If they're talking about Harry openly, they might know we're here, whatever disguises we're wearing." "Ron's right," Harry said. "The woman who stopped me knew exactly who I was with and where. They're watching us. We need to regroup." They slipped back into Honeydukes, their movements cautious and deliberate. The cellar was as they had left it, dark and filled with the sweet scent of confections. One by one they descended through the trapdoor and into the passage that would take them back to Hogwarts. "Lumos," Hermione whispered once the trapdoor was closed behind them. "I don't understand how they knew we were there. We were disguised. We didn't use magic except for entering Honeydukes." The man behind the mask. "Baben must have been following us for a while," Ron suggested. "Maybe since we left the castle." "Or they have some way of detecting Polyjuice Potion," Harry said, remembering the woman's knowing smile. "Either way, we're lucky they didn't attack outright." They walked in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The passage seemed colder on the return journey, the air damper, pressing in around them. "Wait," Hermione said suddenly, stopping so abruptly that Ron bumped into her. "Listen." They all froze, straining their ears. At first, Harry heard nothing but the soft drip of water from the ceiling of the tunnel. Then he caught it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from behind them. "Someone's following us," Ron whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nox," Hermione breathed, extinguishing her wand light. They were plunged into total darkness. Harry reached out, finding Ron's arm to his right and Hermione's shoulder to his left, keeping them connected. They stood motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps grew closer. "We need to move," Harry whispered, quietly, along the wall. Keeping contact with each other, they began to edge forward, feeling their way along the rough wall of the passage. The footsteps behind them continued, unhurried but steady, following their path through the darkness. "How far to the Witch's Hump?" Ron asked, his voice a barely audible murmur. "Too far," Hermione replied. "We need to find a place to hide." But the passage was narrow and straight, offering no alcoves or side tunnels. They could only continue forward, hoping to reach the castle before whoever was behind them caught up. The passage began to slope upward, a sign they were nearing the Hogwarts end. The footsteps behind them quickened slightly, as though their pursuer sensed their destination was close. "Almost there," Harry encouraged. "Just a little further." The witch's hump seemed to take an eternity to appear, a slightly lighter outline in the darkness ahead. They moved toward it as quickly as they dared, still trying to minimize the sound of their passage. "I'll go first," Harry whispered when they finally reached it. "Be ready to follow immediately." He pressed his wand to the stone, murmuring the password. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with the familiar grinding noise that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet passage, the witch's hump began to slide open. "Go, go," Harry urged, helping Hermione through first, then Ron. As he prepared to follow, Harry risked a glance back down the passage. In the faint light spilling from the castle corridor above, he caught a glimpse of their pursuer. A tall figure in a traveling cloak, face obscured by shadow. The figure had stopped, seeming content to watch rather than chase further. Harry hesitated, his curiosity warring with caution. The figure made no move to attack, no move to close the distance between them. After a long moment, the figure raised a hand in what almost seemed like a salute, then turned and began walking unhurriedly back down the passage. Puzzled but relieved, Harry climbed through the opening, the witch's hump sliding shut behind him with a final, decisive click. Ron and Hermione were waiting in the corridor, their polyjuice disguises beginning to fade, features shifting back to their normal appearance. "Did you see who it was?" Hermione asked anxiously. Harry shook his head. "No, but they didn't try to stop us. It was almost like they just wanted to make sure we got back safely." "That makes no sense," Ron said, running a hand through his hair, which was now halfway between the Ravenclaw boy's crop and his own longer style. "Why follow us all that way just to let us go?" "I don't know," Harry admitted. "But I think it's time we talk to Lupin. Something bigger is happening here." They made their way cautiously back to Gryffindor Tower, avoiding the main corridors where they might encounter a teacher or prefect. The castle was quiet, most of its inhabitants long since asleep. The fat lady was dozing in her frame and grumbled at being awakened, but swung open at the password. The common room was deserted when they entered. The fire burned down to embers that cast just enough light to see by. They sank into their usual chairs by the hearth, the familiarity of the space a comfort after the tension of their excursion. "I'll send a message to Lupin first thing in the morning," Harry said, leaning back in his armchair, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Tell him everything we saw." "Do you think the package they mentioned is what the Order is worried about?" Ron asked, sprawling on the hearthrug, his transformation now completely reversed. "Possibly," Hermione said, perching on the arm of Harry's chair. "Or it could be something else entirely. The Death Eaters could be setting up a more permanent presence in Hogsmeade. Whatever it is, we need to be ready," Harry said, thinking of the Lantern of Shadows and its visions of battles to come. "This is just the beginning." They fell silent, each contemplating the implications of what they had witnessed. Outside, the rain had started again, droplets tapping gently against the window panes, a soothing counterpoint to the tension still thrumming through their veins. "We should get some sleep," Hermione eventually suggested, stifling a yawn. "We've done all we can for tonight." Ron nodded in agreement, pushing himself up from the rug with a groan. "Wake me if the Death Eaters decide to invade before breakfast." Despite his attempt at humor, his expression remained serious, his eyes meeting Harry's briefly in silent understanding. The world was changing around them, darkness gathering. As Ron headed for the dormitory stairs, Hermione lingered, her gaze fixed on Harry. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Harry stared into the dying embers of the fire, watching as the last flickers of light danced among the ashes. "I'm thinking about what the woman said, that we've walked into something beyond our capabilities, and I'm wondering if she's right." Hermione's hand found his shoulder, a warm, reassuring pressure. "We've faced impossible odds before," she reminded him, "and we've always found a way through, together." Harry nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Together," Hermione agreed. "Get some rest, Harry. Tomorrow, we plan our next move." As Hermione disappeared up the girls' staircase, Harry remained in his chair, watching the last ember fade to darkness. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the late hour. Harry thought of the figure in the passage, that strange, almost respectful salute. An ally? An enemy? Or something in between? In this shadow war of spies and secrets, it was becoming increasingly difficult to tell. The faces of those they had encountered in Hogsmeade flashed through his mind. Mundungus with his cryptic warning, the elegant woman with her cold smile and knowledge of their movements, the shadowy figure who had followed them through the passage only to let them go. What were they planning? What was this package they spoke of? And why had his name been mentioned? One thing was certain, the rules of engagement were changing. No longer was this a straightforward battle between light and dark. Now it was a game of patience and observation, of reading the enemy's movements without revealing your own. The fire had died completely now, leaving the common room in darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Harry realized how tired he was, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. Yet his mind continued to race, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered, to make sense of this new phase of the war. The Lantern of Shadows had shown them glimpses of battles to come, and Sirius's training ground had begun to prepare them. But tonight had revealed a different kind of conflict, one fought not with wands and spells in the open, but with whispers and secrets in the shadows. Finally, Harry rose from his chair and made his way up the spiral staircase to the boys' dormitory. The room was filled with the soft sounds of sleep, Ron's gentle snores, Neville's occasional mumbles about plants, Seamus's deeper breathing. The familiarity of it was comforting, a reminder that despite the darkness gathering outside, there were still pockets of normalcy, of safety. Harry changed quietly into his pajamas and slipped into bed, drawing the curtains around him. He placed his glasses on the bedside table and lay back, staring up at the canopy above him, though he could barely make it out in the darkness. As his body relaxed into the mattress, his thoughts gradually slowed. The rain against the window had settled into a gentle, steady rhythm, almost like a lullaby. Harry let it wash over him, let it carry away the tension of the night's adventure. In the space between wakefulness and sleep, an image formed in his mind, the golden figures from Sirius's training ground, moving in their choreographed battle, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to work together, how to trust each other's strengths. And alongside it, the shadows the lantern had shown them, battles yet to come, but not yet written in stone. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "You've walked into something far beyond your capabilities." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps they were out of their depth, but they had been before, many times, and had found a way forward. With that thought, Harry closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain carry him towards sleep. And if his dreams were filled with moonlit chases through misty streets, with shadows that moved where no one stood and reflections that showed faces other than his own, well, such dreams were far from the worst he had known. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries to unravel, but for tonight the chase was ended. The hunters and the hunted both returned to their separate lairs to plan their next moves in this ever-shifting game of shadows. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited, neither fixed nor fluid, but responsive to the choices they would make, the paths they would choose, the courage they would find within themselves when the moment of decision came. For now, though, there was only the gentle patter of rain, the warmth of blankets, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else since that first day on the Hogwarts Express. Together, the last rays of summer sunlight filtered through the high windows of Hogwarts Castle, casting long golden beams across the ancient stone floors. Harry Potter walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet evening air. It had been years since the final battle, years since these walls had trembled with curses and cries, yet Harry could still feel the weight of those memories as he made his way through the familiar passageway. He had come back to speak to the 7th year Defense Against the Dark Arts students tomorrow about their NETW examinations, but tonight the castle belonged to memories and shadows. The portraits nodded respectfully as he passed, a few calling out gentle greetings which Harry answered with a soft smile. Nearly headless Nick floated by, offering a deep bow that nearly dislodged his partially severed head before continuing on his spectral rounds. The castle was peaceful at this hour. Most students had retreated to their common rooms after dinner, leaving the corridors to whispered conversations between portraits and the occasional patrolling ghost. Harry's fingers trailed along the cool stone wall as he walked, feeling the slight unevenness of the ancient masonry beneath his fingertips. "Still feels like home," he murmured to himself, watching as a suit of armor adjusted its position, the metal plates moving with surprising grace for something so bulky. The corridor opened to the grand staircase, and Harry paused, gazing up at the shifting staircases above. Candlelight flickered from wall sconces, casting warm pools of light that fought back the deepening blue of evening visible through the high windows. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, pinpricks of silver against the deep indigo. Harry descended the stairs toward the entrance hall, taking his time, in no particular hurry. The worn stone steps had been repaired after the battle, but still bore the almost imperceptible marks of that night. A slight discoloration here, a patched section there. Only those who had been present during those dark hours would notice such subtle reminders. As he reached the entrance hall, Harry's gaze was drawn inevitably to the huge wooden doors of the great hall. They stood partially open, allowing a soft glow to spill out into the entrance hall. Almost without conscious decision, his feet carried him toward those doors, toward the heart of Hogwarts. The great hall was empty, save for a few lingering professors at the high table. McGonagall deep in conversation with Flitwick, Neville examining what appeared to be a small potted plant, its leaves gently swaying despite the still air. The longhouse tables stretched before him, polished wood gleaming in the light of hundreds of floating candles. Harry's gaze drifted upward to the enchanted ceiling. It mirrored the night sky outside, deep blue with stars beginning to appear, a few wisps of cloud drifting lazily across its expanse. The ceiling had been one of the most difficult features to restore after the battle, requiring the combined efforts of many skilled witches and wizards to recreate the complex enchantments that had been damaged during the fighting. As Harry watched, a curious thing happened. The stars above seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns he didn't recognize. The blue deepened, and then, gradually, like watercolors bleeding into parchment, the ceiling began to change. The stars dimmed, replaced by a soft golden glow that spread across the enchanted surface. Harry stood transfixed as the glow coalesced into shapes, human figures moving in silent tableau, their forms composed of shimmering light. The battle at the ceiling was showing him the Battle of Hogwarts, but not as he remembered it, not with the chaos, the fear, the deafening noise. This was something else, something almost beautiful. Not handsome, grisly, classy, a wolf span. Not Basil, not man but force, like the sea of mass men. Harry's breath caught as he recognized a golden figure of himself, wand raised defensively as a silver spell arced toward him, frozen in mid-flight. Nearby, Ron and Hermione stood back to back, their light-formed countenances determined, resolute. All around them the members of the DA, the Order of the Phoenix, professors and students alike, moved in this silent choreography of resistance. "The castle remembers," came a soft voice beside him. Harry turned to find Professor McGonagall standing at his shoulder, her eyes reflecting the golden light from above. "Hogwarts has always had its own kind of magic," she continued, her Scottish brogue softened with the years but still distinctly present. "Beyond what we teach within these walls, sometimes it shows us what we need to see." "I've never seen it do this before," Harry said, his voice hushed as though afraid to disturb the silent tableau above. "It doesn't happen often," McGonagall acknowledged. "Only on certain nights, when the stars align just so, and when someone who was part of that history is present. Someone who needs to remember." Harry looked back up at the ceiling. The scene had shifted, showing now the moment when Neville had pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat, the blade gleaming silver against the golden light of his form. Around him others rallied, drawing courage from his act of defiance. "I remember it plenty," Harry said softly. "Sometimes too well." McGonagall's hand came to rest briefly on his shoulder, the touch light but reassuring. "There is a difference, Potter, between remembering with pain and remembering with understanding. Perhaps tonight, Hogwarts is offering you the latter." With that, she gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze and departed, her footsteps fading into the quiet of the hall, leaving Harry alone with the memories playing out above. The scene had changed again. Now it showed the defenders of Hogwarts forming a line across the entrance hall, their wands raised in unison, creating a shield of light that protected the younger students retreating behind them. Harry watched as the golden figures of Professor Flitwick, Professor Sprout, and several seventh-year students maintained the shield while others ushered the children to safety. For the first time, Harry was seeing the battle not as he had experienced it, fragmented, desperate, terrifying, but as a whole. From this distance, he could see the patterns of bravery, the moments of selflessness that had been obscured in the chaos of the moment. Drawn by the silent spectacle, Harry moved deeper into the great hall, taking a seat at the end of the Gryffindor table. The wood was smooth beneath his hands, polished by countless elbows and the passage of time. Above, the golden figures continued their silent retelling of that fateful night. He saw Fred and George fighting side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized even in battle. He saw Luna Lovegood deflecting a curse with an almost dreamy grace, sending it harmlessly into a wall. He saw Professor McGonagall animating the Stone Knights of Hogwarts, sending them marching into battle with grim determination. Each scene flowed into the next, connected not by time but by theme: courage in the face of darkness, loyalty in the face of fear, hope in the face of despair. The air in the great hall had grown very still, as though the castle itself was holding its breath. Even the candles seemed to burn more steadily, their flames motionless despite the gentle draught that usually made them flicker. Only the golden figures moved, their light casting no shadows on the tables below. Harry leaned back, allowing the tension to drain from his shoulders. For so long these memories had been tangled with guilt and grief. For Fred, for Lupin and Tonks, for Colin, for everyone who had fallen that night. But now, watching the battle unfold in this strange, silent pantomime, he found himself seeing beyond the loss to something else. The extraordinary unity, the unwavering resolve that had ultimately led to victory. The scene above shifted once more, and Harry recognized the courtyard. Golden figures scattered across the open space, dueling, defending, a complex choreography of light and shadow. And then, moving through the center, two figures approached each other, Harry and Voldemort, wands extended. Harry watched his own face, composed of golden light, set with determination rather than fear. Even in this silent reenactment, the moment carried weight, a pivotal point around which the fate of their world had turned. As the two figures' spells met, connecting their wands with a bridge of light, something remarkable happened. The golden light began to spread outward from that connection, flowing like water across the ceiling, bathing the entire great hall in a warm, gentle radiance. The spell connection between the figures of Harry and Voldemort grew brighter, pulsing with light that seemed to come from deep within the castle itself. Then, slowly, the figure of Voldemort began to dissolve, fragments of his form drifting away like sparks from a dying fire, until only Harry remained, wand still raised, surrounded by light. The golden glow remained for a moment longer, then gradually receded, returning to the enchanted ceiling which once again showed the night sky, stars twinkling peacefully against the darkness. Harry released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The weight that had accompanied his memories of that night felt somehow lighter now, transformed by the castle's peculiar magic. Rising from the bench, Harry made his way back toward the entrance hall, his footsteps quiet against the stone floor. The candles seemed to dim slightly as he passed, as though Hogwarts itself was settling into the peaceful rhythms of the night. Instead of heading toward the guest quarters that had been prepared for him, Harry found himself drawn toward the marble staircase once again. His feet carried him upward, through corridors and passageways that awakened memories with each step. Some from the battle, yes, but many more from his years as a student, learning and growing within these walls. He passed the corridor where he, Ron, and Hermione had once encountered Fluffy guarding the trap door, past the bathroom where they had brewed Polyjuice Potion in their second year, past classrooms where they had learnt to transform teacups into rats, to defend against boggarts, to brew potions both simple and complex. Hogwarts at night had always held a special kind of magic, a quiet expectancy, as though the ancient stones themselves were dreaming of the countless students who had passed through their embrace. Tonight, that feeling was especially strong, the castle seeming to respond to Harry's presence with subtle signs. Torches brightening slightly as he approached, suits of armor standing a little straighter, portraits watching him with gentle smiles as he passed. Eventually, he found himself on the 7th floor, standing before a familiar blank wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy attempting to teach trolls ballet. The Room of Requirement. During that final year, the room had been a sanctuary for those resisting the Carrows regime, a place of refuge and resistance. Almost without conscious thought, Harry paced before the wall 3 times, focusing his need. I need to see what happened here. I need to understand. Slowly, a door materialized in the stone wall. Not the familiar door to the room of requirement as he had known it, but something different. This door was made of light, its edges softly blurred, glowing with the same golden radiance he had seen in the Great Hall. Harry reached out, his hand hesitating for just a moment before pushing the door open. Light spilled out, warm and inviting, and he stepped through. Inside was not the room of requirement as he remembered it, but a vast open space filled with floating orbs of golden light. They hung suspended in the air, each about the size of a snitch, glowing softly in the dimness. As Harry moved among them, he realized that each orb contained a memory, not his own, but those of Hogwarts itself. He approached one of the nearest orbs, which seemed to pulse slightly brighter as he neared. Within its golden surface he could see a scene forming. Neville standing before a group of younger students in this very room, teaching them the shield charm during those dark days when the Carrows ruled Hogwarts. Neville's face was bruised, bearing the marks of punishment, but his expression was determined, patient, as he guided a small Hufflepuff boy through the proper wand movement. Harry moved to another orb. This one showed Luna and Ginny painting Dumbledore's army, still recruiting, on the corridor wall outside the Great Hall, their movements quick but precise, faces tight with concentration as they worked swiftly to avoid detection. Another orb revealed Seamus Finnegan helping a first-year girl whose brother had been taken by the Carrows, offering her a chocolate frog and a quiet word of reassurance. Orb after orb, memory after memory, not of the battle itself, but of the countless small acts of resistance and kindness that had preceded it. The DA members caring for younger students, teaching them to defend themselves, friends supporting each other through dark times, small victories celebrated in hushed voices, defeats mourned together in solidarity. It wasn't just one night, was it? Harry murmured to the empty room. The battle was fought every day in ways I never saw. As if in response, the orbs of light began to move, swirling slowly around him like a galaxy of golden stars. They circled faster, their individual scenes blurring together, until they merged into a single shimmering sphere that enveloped Harry completely. Within this sphere of light he could feel rather than see the memories, the courage, the fear, the hope, the determination that had filled these walls during that year of darkness. The emotions washed over him, through him, connecting him to each person who had stood against the darkness in their own way. Then, gradually, the light began to recede, the golden sphere contracting until it hung before him about the size of a quaffle, pulsing gently. As Harry watched, the sphere drifted toward him, coming to rest directly over his heart. For a moment, he felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of connection to the castle and all who had fought within its walls. Then the sphere of light sank into him, merging with his own memories, his own understanding. The room around him began to fade, the walls becoming transparent, then dissolving completely to reveal that he was standing in an ordinary corridor. The room of requirement had vanished, leaving behind only the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy and the solid stone wall. Yet Harry felt changed, as though the castle had shared something precious with him. Not just memories of what had happened, but a deeper truth about what it had all meant. He continued his walk through the sleeping castle, his steps lighter now. The corridors were quiet, the portraits drowsing in their frames, the suits of armor standing silent guard. Through the windows he could see that the night had deepened, stars crowding the velvet sky above the castle towers. As he reached the base of the astronomy tower, Harry paused, looking up at the spiraling staircase. This had been the site of another pivotal moment. Dumbledore's fall, the night when everything had seemed lost. For a long time after the war, Harry had avoided this place, the memories too painful to revisit. But tonight, with the castle's magic still warm within him, he found himself beginning to climb. The stairs wound upward, cool night air flowing down from the open observation platform above. Harry's hand trailed along the stone wall as he ascended, feeling the subtle vibrations of the castle's magic. Each step brought him closer to the place where Dumbledore had fallen, yet the anxiety he usually associated with this memory remained curiously absent. When he reached the top, he found the observation platform bathed in starlight. The stone parapet where Dumbledore had stood his final ground was illuminated by the gentle glow of the waxing moon, which hung low in the eastern sky. Harry approached the edge, placing his hands on the cool stone, gazing out over the grounds of Hogwarts. From this height, he could see the entirety of the castle grounds, the dark expanse of the Forbidden Forest, the silver ribbon of the lake, Hagrid's hut with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Beyond, the mountains rose in silhouette against the star-strewn sky, their peaks touched with the first dusting of early autumn snow. As he stood there, a curious sensation began to wash over him. The stone beneath his hands grew warm, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with an invisible presence. Harry remained still, sensing that the castle was about to reveal something more. Slowly, a figure of golden light began to form beside him, tall, slender, with half-moon spectacles and a long, flowing beard. Dumbledore, or rather, the castle's memory of him, rendered in the same shimmering light that had illuminated the battle scenes in the Great Hall. The figure did not speak, these memories had no sound, but turned to Harry with an expression of such gentle understanding that words seemed unnecessary. The golden Dumbledore gestured outward, encompassing the castle, the grounds, and beyond, as if to say, "Look at what you helped preserve. Look at what continues because of what you did." Then the figure pointed to Harry's chest, directly over his heart, before placing its own hand over its heart in mirror image. The message was clear, even without words. What truly matters is what lives on in here. The golden Dumbledore smiled, his eyes twinkling with that familiar light that even death could not diminish, then slowly faded, dissolving into motes of light that drifted away on the gentle night breeze. Harry remained at the parapet for a while longer, letting the peace of the moment settle around him like a comfortable cloak. The guilt and grief that had been his companions for so long seemed lighter now, tempered by the castle's gentle reminder of what had been achieved, what had been saved. Eventually, he turned from the view and made his way back down the spiral staircase. The castle corridors welcomed him, torches burning with a steady, warm glow that seemed to mirror his own newfound sense of tranquility. His wandering feet carried him past the library, where so many hours had been spent researching, planning, preparing for challenges that had seemed insurmountable at the time. Past the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey had mended countless injuries, magical and mundane alike. Past empty classrooms where generations of young witches and wizards had learned not just spells and potions, but courage, friendship, and the true nature of magic. As he walked, Harry began to notice something subtle but unmistakable. Wherever he passed, the castle seemed to respond. Not with the dramatic displays of the Great Hall or the Room of Requirement, but with small signs of acknowledgement. Torches burning a little brighter, suits of armor offering the slightest of nods. even the stone beneath his feet feeling somehow more solid, more welcoming. It was as though Hogwarts itself was offering a kind of benediction, an assurance that what had happened here had meaning beyond the victories and losses of that final battle. The castle had endured, had healed, had continued its ancient purpose of nurturing young minds, and in that continuity lay the true victory over the darkness that had threatened to extinguish it all. Harry's path eventually led him to the entrance hall once more. The great oak doors stood closed against the night, their massive iron hinges gleaming in the torchlight. On impulse, Harry approached them, placing his palm flat against the ancient wood. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling slightly foolish but somehow certain that the castle could hear him. "For showing me, for helping me understand." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, very gently, the wood beneath his hand grew warm, and a soft pulse of magic traveled up his arm, like a heartbeat responding to his own. Hogwarts had heard him. Hogwarts understood. With a sense of completion, Harry turned away from the doors and began making his way toward the guest quarters that awaited him. As he climbed the marble staircase once more, he found his eyelids growing heavy, the events of the evening settling into a peaceful weariness that promised deep, dreamless sleep. The guest chambers were located in a quiet wing of the castle, away from the student dormitories. Professor McGonagall had mentioned at dinner that they had been prepared with fresh linens and a warming charm against the autumn chill. As Harry approached, he could see the door standing slightly ajar, a soft glow emanating from within. The room beyond was simple but comfortable. A four-poster bed with deep blue hangings, a writing desk beneath the window, a small fireplace where flames danced cheerfully over glowing coals. A pair of slippers had been placed neatly beside the bed, and a steaming mug of something that smelled of cinnamon and cloves sat on the bedside table. Harry closed the door behind him, the latch catching with a gentle click. The fire's warmth reached out to him, chasing away the slight chill he had accumulated during his wanderings through the castle corridors. He moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds one last time before drawing the curtains closed. The bed welcomed him, the mattress yielding just enough beneath his weight, the pillows cradling his head as he settled back against them. Harry took a sip from the waiting mug, hot chocolate, rich and sweet, with just a hint of spice that lingered pleasantly on his tongue. Setting the mug aside, he removed his glasses, placing them on the bedside table, before extinguishing the lamps with a wave of his hand. Only the firelight remained, casting shifting patterns of warm light across the ceiling above. As he drifted towards sleep, Harry found his thoughts turning not to the battle or its aftermath, but to the day ahead. Tomorrow he would stand before a class of seventh-year students, many of whom had been too young to remember the war. He would tell them not just about defense against dark magic, but about the importance of unity, of standing together against darkness in all its forms. He would tell them that courage comes in many forms, not just in grand battles, but in small acts of kindness, in standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult, in extending a hand to those in need. He would tell them that the true magic of Hogwarts lies not just in its enchanted ceilings and moving staircases, but in the connections forged within its walls. Connections that remain long after they've left these halls. The fire burned lower, the flames subsiding into glowing embers that cast the room in a gentle, ruddy light. Outside, the night continued its peaceful passage, stars wheeling slowly overhead, the moon casting its silver light across the sleeping castle. Within the ancient walls of Hogwarts, countless stories had unfolded over the centuries. Tales of triumph and tragedy, of discovery and loss, of beginnings and endings. Harry's story was but one thread in that vast tapestry, Yet as he closed his eyes, he felt the profound connection between his own journey and the enduring spirit of this place. The echoes of the final battle would always remain, written into the very stones of the castle. But they were not the only echoes that filled these halls. Laughter, friendship, discovery, wonder. These too were woven into the fabric of Hogwarts, creating a harmony that transcended the darker notes of conflict and pain. As sleep claimed him at last, Harry's last conscious thought was of gratitude for the castle's gentle wisdom, for the peace that had been won, for the opportunity to share what he had learned with the next generation of witches and wizards who would walk these halls. In his dreams, he walked once more through the corridors of Hogwarts, but now they were filled with golden light, warm and comforting, and all around him the castle whispered its ancient truth, that darkness may come, but it always passes, that what is broken can be mended, that what truly matters endures. The battle was over, the light remained, and in that knowledge there was peace. Our magical journey through Hogwarts comes to a close for tonight. Now you'll hear the gentle crackling of the common room fire and soothing ambient sounds of the castle to accompany you as you drift off to sleep. These calming sounds will continue without any advertisements or interruptions. May your dreams be filled with magic and wonder, and may you sleep as peacefully as if you were tucked away in your cozy four-poster bed in the dormitory. Good night, dear witch or wizard, until our next adventure in the wizarding world.